Growing up, I always felt like an outsider in my own family. My parents, Rachel and Martin, had two children, my older brother, Liam, and me. Liam was 3 years older than I was, and from as far back as I can remember, he was always the favorite. Unlike me, he was healthy, obedient, and everything they wanted in a child. Meanwhile, I was diagnosed with epilepsy at a young age. That alone would have been challenging for any family. But by the time I turned 8, additional diagnoses of dyslexia and ADHD cemented the divide between me and my parents. I think they saw me as defective, a burden they hadn't signed up for. And while I understand that parenting a child with special needs isn't easy, I also believe it's a responsibility you accept when you choose to bring a child into the world. Unfortunately, my parents didn't see it that way. They acted as though I was an accident they couldn't undo, and they didn't even try to hide it. It wasn't always blatant neglect. Sometimes their disappointment showed in the subtle ways they treated me differently from Liam. He got their encouragement, their affection, and their attention, while I got their sighs and their frustration. They would brag about Liam's accomplishments at family gatherings, while I was mostly ignored unless my behavior needed to be excused. For a while, I thought this was normal. It's amazing what a child will accept as reality when they don't know any better. But by the time I was 6, I started noticing how other families operated. My friends' parents would cheer them on at soccer games or hug them for getting a good grade. My parents rarely did that for me, even when I did something they should have been proud of. By 8, I stopped trying to earn their approval. What was the point? It didn't matter how hard I worked. I'd never be Liam. I spent most of my childhood walking on eggshells, hoping to avoid their criticism or disappointment. But even when I stayed quiet, my presence was enough to drain the energy from any room. It felt like I sucked the air out of their lives just by existing. The disparity between how they treated Liam and me became even more apparent as I grew older. While they celebrated his milestones, like winning a debate competition or getting good grades, my achievements went unnoticed. Once I brought home a painting from school that my teacher had praised, and my mom barely glanced at it before dismissively saying, "That's nice." She didn't even put it in the fridge like she did for Liam's projects. Liam wasn't a bad brother, but he didn't stand up for me either. I don't think he realized how deep the divide went, and if he did, he probably thought it wasn't his place to intervene. I don't hold it against him. We were kids, after all, but it stung nonetheless. As I entered my teenage years, the emotional toll became overwhelming. I started acting out, not because I wanted to hurt anyone, but because I was desperate for attention. Any attention? If my parents weren't going to notice me for the good things, maybe they'd notice the bad. I skipped homework, disrupted classes, and stopped caring about my grades. Eventually, I flunked a few subjects, but even that didn't get the reaction I'd hoped for. My parents would sigh, shake their heads, and occasionally mutter about how difficult I was, but they never sat me down to ask why I was struggling or how they could help. By the time I turned 14, my rebellion had reached new heights. One day, I bought a pack of cigarettes to school and decided to light one up in the middle of class. When my teacher confronted me, I flipped him off. It was reckless and immature, but at that moment, I didn't care. I was angry at the world, but mostly at my parents for making me feel like I was unworthy of love. The school called my parents, and this time, their reaction was different. They were livid. I'd been in trouble before, but this was the final straw for them. That night, they screamed at me like never before, saying things I'll never forget. "You've been nothing but a burden since the day you were born," my mom yelled. "If we'd known you'd turn out like this, we never would have had you," my dad added. Hearing those words from my own parents felt like a punch to the gut. I knew they didn't like me, but this was the first time they openly admitted they regretted having me. It was devastating. After the argument, I was grounded for a week, but it didn't stop there. One morning, my parents told me to pack my things. They didn't say why, just that I needed to be ready to leave in an hour. My brother helped my mom shove my belongings into bags while I sat in the car, too stunned to protest. We drove for an hour before pulling up to my grandmother's house. My dad's mom, Louise, had always been kind to me, but I hadn't seen her much in recent years. As we unloaded my things onto her porch, my parents explained what was happening. "You're staying here from now on?" my dad said. "We're done. We can't deal with you anymore," my mom added. "Maybe Louise can straighten you out, but we don't want you back." They left without so much as a goodbye. Standing there, surrounded by my bags, I felt a strange mix of relief and heartbreak. On one hand, I was finally free from the constant judgment and disappointment. On the other hand, my own parents had just abandoned me. It was clear they'd never loved me the way a parent should. Louise stepped outside and hugged me tightly. "You're not a burden," she said softly. "We'll figure this out together." For the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope. Growing up, I had always been acutely aware of the unspoken divide in my family. By the time I was 8, my world had already begun to revolve around the realization that I wasn't like my older brother Liam. Where Liam was the golden boy, athletic, smart, and confident, I struggled to keep up in school and life. My epilepsy diagnosis was just the beginning. The added challenges of ADHD and dyslexia turned me into what my parents, despite never saying it aloud, clearly saw as a burden. But as the years went on, their disappointment became more evident, and the divide between Liam and me grew sharper. Every academic award he brought home was celebrated with enthusiasm and pride, while my mere existence seemed to be a chore for them to tolerate. I could hear the muffled frustration in their voices when they thought I wasn't listening, the sighs when they had to accommodate my medical appointments, and the unspoken question, why couldn't I just be normal? When I was 14, that tension reached a boiling point. School had become my battleground, a place where I was constantly reminded of my failures, not just by teachers, but by the classmates who mocked my stumbles and difficulties. One day, in a haze of frustration and rebellion, I decided to make a statement. I smuggled a pack of cigarettes to school and lit one right in the middle of English class. It was reckless, impulsive, and completely out of character for the quiet, angry kid I had become. When the teacher demanded that I leave, I flipped him off. That was the straw that broke the camel's back. The school, which had already been lenient with my frequent infractions, expelled me. When my parents found out, their reaction was worse than anything I had imagined. It wasn't just anger. They were furious in a way that seemed to drain whatever affection they had left for me. They didn't hold back that day. Every thought they'd clearly suppressed for years came spilling out. "You've ruined this family," my mother Karen said through gritted teeth, her voice trembling with barely controlled rage. "If we'd known you'd turn out like this, we never would have had you. You're a burden, Emily," my father, Robert, added coldly, his words cutting sharper than anything I'd ever heard. "We should have stopped at Liam. At least we wouldn't be dealing with this mess." The words left me stunned. I'd always suspected that I wasn't wanted, but to hear it confirmed so explicitly felt like my world had been flipped upside down. For the next week, I was effectively locked in my room. They didn't even try to hide their contempt anymore. Meals were left outside my door like I was some sort of prisoner. I felt isolated, not just physically, but emotionally, as though they had severed whatever fragile thread connected us as a family. Then came the day I was forced to pack my things. Karen and Robert didn't even give me the courtesy of doing it myself. Liam stayed out of it, as he always did, while my mother and father packed my belongings into a couple of old suitcases. I sat in the car, silent and defeated, as they drove me to my grandmother's house. Barely an hour away, my grandmother Margaret had always been a comforting presence in my life. She lived in a modest, cozy home on the outskirts of town. Visits to her house were the only times I ever felt truly seen, heard, and valued. Still, I hadn't expected my parents to leave me there permanently. I thought this would be a cooling-off period, a temporary arrangement until they calmed down. But the moment we arrived, that illusion shattered. Margaret greeted us with her usual warm smile, but that quickly faded as she realized what was happening. Karen handed her my suitcases without ceremony, and Robert declared, "She's your problem now. We're done." I begged them not to leave me, even as my father waved me off dismissively. "You've embarrassed us for the last time, Emily," he said, his tone devoid of emotion. "Don't call, don't write, we're moving on." I turned to Margaret, who looked just as shocked and horrified as I felt. For the first time in my life, I saw her struggle to find the right words. She didn't hesitate to take me in. She never would have, but the reality of what was being asked of her weighed heavily. Margaret was in her late 60s, a widow who had long since settled into her quiet life. Taking in a troubled teenager wasn't exactly in her plans. As we stood in the doorway, my parents' final words to Margaret still ring in my ears. "She's a freak, Margaret. We can't deal with her anymore. Liam deserves better. Those words stayed with me long after their car disappeared down the street. I felt gutted, betrayed not just by their actions, but by the brutal honesty of their cruelty. For years, I had fought to gain their approval, their love, and their understanding. Now, it was painfully clear that those things had never been available to me, no matter how hard I tried. Margaret, ever the diplomat, ushered me inside, sat me down at the kitchen table, and brewed a pot of tea. For a long moment, we just sat there in silence, the weight of the day pressing down on both of us. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but firm. "I won't sugarcoat this, Emily," she said. "I didn't expect this, and I'm not sure how well I can handle it. But I do know one thing. You're not a burden. You're not a freak, and we're going to figure this out together." Hearing those words brought tears to my eyes. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I felt like someone was willing to fight for me. Margaret wasn't perfect, and she was honest about her limitations. But that honesty was exactly what I needed. It was the beginning of something new, a chapter where I would no longer have to fight for love or approval, but could begin to heal. That night, for the first time in years, I went to bed feeling a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The first morning at Grandma Margaret's house was strange. I woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside her small kitchen window, the kind of peaceful quiet I wasn't used to. No slamming doors, no muffled arguments from my parents' bedroom, just calm. For a moment, I forgot where I was and why I was there. Then reality sank in like a lead weight. I shuffled out of the tiny guest bedroom she had hastily cleaned out for me. Grandma was already at the kitchen table, sipping her coffee and reading the newspaper. She glanced up when I walked in and gave me a smile that was both kind and cautious. It reminded me of how someone might approach a wounded animal, gentle, but prepared for resistance. "Morning, sweetheart. Did you sleep okay?" she asked. I shrugged and muttered, "It was fine." I wasn't ready to open up yet, even to her. She didn't press further, just nodded and gestured toward the plate of toast and scrambled eggs waiting for me. We ate in silence for a bit, the sound of clinking silverware filling the void. Finally, Grandma set her mug down and leaned back in her chair. "Emily," she began, her voice careful, "I know this isn't how you wanted things to be. I can't imagine what you've been through, but I want us to make this work. I'll do my part if you'll do yours." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I wanted to believe her, but part of me felt skeptical. My parents had made promises before, and those promises had turned into broken glass under my feet. But this was different. Margaret wasn't Karen or Robert. She didn't see me as a freak, at least not yet. "What do you mean by my part?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. She smiled faintly. "Just that you try your best. School, chores, all of it. I know you've had a rough time, but this is a fresh start. For both of us. Let's give it a fair shot, okay?" I nodded. What else could I do? I had nowhere else to go. At least she was giving me the dignity of asking instead of demanding. That felt new, and honestly, it felt good. Over the next few weeks, life with Grandma began to take shape. It wasn't easy at first. Margaret was set in her ways, and I wasn't used to a structure that wasn't enforced by anger or frustration. But she was patient, something my parents had never been. She didn't yell when I forgot to do the dishes or got distracted halfway through folding the laundry. Instead, she'd gently remind me, her tone more encouraging than scolding. "One thing at a time, Emily," she'd say. "You'll get there." School was the biggest hurdle. After the expulsion, Margaret had to pull some serious strings to get me into a small private school nearby. The class sizes were smaller, and the teachers seemed genuinely interested in helping me succeed. Margaret made sure to explain my conditions to them, something my parents had never bothered to do. For the first time, I wasn't treated like I was stupid or lazy. The teachers adjusted their methods, giving me extra time on assignments and breaking down instructions in ways I could understand. Slowly but surely, my grades began to improve. I wasn't acing anything, but I wasn't failing either. For me, that was a victory. Margaret was my biggest cheerleader. Every time I brought home a passing grade, she'd beam with pride and stick the paper on the fridge. "See? I told you you could do it," she'd say, patting my shoulder. It felt strange to have someone believe in me, but it also felt good. Slowly, the walls I had built around myself began to crack. One evening, about 2 months after I'd moved in, Margaret and I sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. She sipped her tea while I fiddled with a loose thread on my sweater. The air was cool, and the quiet of the countryside wrapped around us like a blanket. "Emily," she said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. "Can I ask you something?" I glanced at her, a little wary. "Sure. Do you miss them? Your parents?" Her question caught me off guard. I stared at the horizon, my mind a jumble of emotions. Did I miss them? The people who had abandoned me, locked me in my room, called me a freak? I didn't want to, but a part of me did. A part of me still craved their approval, their love, even though I knew it would never come. "I don't know," I finally admitted. "Sometimes, I guess I miss the idea of them, you know? Like, what they could have been if they were different." Margaret nodded, her expression thoughtful. "That makes sense. It's okay to feel that way. But you know, sweetheart, you're not defined by how they treated you. You're stronger than that." Her words struck a chord deep within me. For years, I'd let my parents' rejection shape how I saw myself. I was the problem, the burden, the freak, but maybe, just maybe, that wasn't the whole truth. Maybe I was more than that. Life with Margaret wasn't perfect, but it was better than anything I'd known before. She wasn't just a caretaker. She became my ally, my friend, and the family I had always needed. With her help, I began to rebuild not just my life, but my sense of self-worth. For the first time, I started to believe that I wasn't a burden. I wasn't a freak. I was just Emily. And for now, that was enough. By the time I had been living with Grandma Margaret for about a year, life had settled into a rhythm. It wasn't perfect. I still had moments when my frustration bubbled over, and I lashed out or retreated into myself, but things were better. Margaret had given me something my parents never had: stability. The small private school she'd enrolled me in was a world away from my old one. The teachers were patient, the classes were manageable, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I was being set up to fail. It took me months to shake the anxiety I felt walking into a classroom, half expecting a teacher to berate me for something I hadn't even done yet. But over time, those fears faded. My grades improved. I wasn't the smartest kid in the room, but I was trying. And for Margaret, that was enough. "You're doing great," she'd tell me every time I brought home a progress report. "See? I told you you had it in you." Hearing her say that made me want to keep trying. I wanted to make her proud, not out of fear or obligation, but because she genuinely believed in me. Margaret was always honest about the challenges of raising a teenager, especially one who came with as much baggage as I did. She never sugarcoated her struggles or pretended she had all the answers. One evening, as we were cleaning up after dinner, she sighed and leaned against the counter. "Emily, I'm going to be real with you," she said, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Some days I feel like I'm in over my head, but I want you to know, even when it's hard, I don't regret this. Not for a second." Her candor caught me off guard, but it also reassured me. She wasn't pretending everything was fine or acting like she was some saint for taking me in. She was just being Margaret, honest, kind, and doing her best. As time went on, I started to notice small but significant changes in myself. The anger that had once consumed me began to fade. It wasn't gone entirely. There were still moments when I felt a pang of resentment toward my parents, or a surge of frustration when I struggled with something that came easily to others. But it wasn't as all-encompassing as it had been before. Part of that was because of Margaret's unwavering support. She didn't just tell me to get over it or try harder like my parents had. She helped me find ways to cope. She found a counselor for me to talk to, someone who didn't judge me or make me feel like I was broken beyond repair. For the first time, I felt like my feelings were valid, and that made all the difference. One of the biggest turning points came during a school play. The drama teacher had encouraged me to audition, saying he thought it would be good for me. I was hesitant at first. Me, on stage, in front of a crowd. No way! But Margaret convinced me to give it a shot. "What's the worst that could happen?" she asked with a twinkle in her eye. "If you don't like it, you don't have to do it again. But you might surprise yourself." I ended up landing a small role, just a few lines, but it was enough to light a spark in me. For the first time in years, I felt confident. Standing on that stage, I wasn't Emily the troubled kid or Emily the freak. I was just Emily, saying her lines and doing her best. When the curtain closed on opening night, the applause was deafening, and I spotted Margaret in the front row, clapping so hard her hands were red. "You were amazing," she gushed after the show, pulling me into a tight hug. I knew you could do it. Her pride was contagious. For the first time, I felt like I had accomplished something real, something that was mine. It wasn't about making up for my past mistakes or proving myself to anyone. It was just about doing something I loved. Of course, not everything was smooth sailing. My parents still visited Margaret occasionally, though they never spoke to me. Margaret had made it clear to them that if they wanted to visit her, they had to respect my boundaries. I appreciated her for that, but their presence still stirred up old wounds. Every time they came around, I felt like I was 14 again, desperate for their approval and angry that I would never get it. "They don't define you, Emily," Margaret reminded me one evening after they had left. "You're so much more than they'll ever see. Don't let them hold you back." I nodded, wanting to believe her, but it was hard. The scars they'd left ran deep, and I wasn't sure they'd ever fully heal. As the years passed, Margaret's influence helped me grow into someone I barely recognized. I graduated high school, something I hadn't thought possible when I first moved in with her. The day I walked across that stage to accept my diploma, Margaret was there, cheering louder than anyone else. "I'm so proud of you," she said afterward, tears streaming down her face. "You've come so far, Emily. This is just the beginning." Her words stayed with me as I started the next chapter of my life. I enrolled in college, something I never thought I'd be able to do, and began studying psychology. I wanted to help kids like me, kids who felt like they didn't belong, who thought they were broken or unworthy. Margaret had shown me that wasn't true, and I wanted to pass that on. Through it all, Margaret remained my rock. She was there for every milestone, every setback, every moment of doubt. She wasn't perfect, nobody is, but she was exactly what I needed. Living with her taught me that family isn't about biology or shared bloodlines. It's about love, support, and showing up for each other, even when it's hard. Margaret was the family I'd always wanted, and because of her, I finally started to believe that I was enough just the way I was. Life was starting to feel normal, something I hadn't experienced in years. College was challenging but fulfilling, and I was discovering a new version of myself, one I hadn't thought could exist. Margaret's unwavering belief in me became my internal compass, guiding me through self-doubt and tough moments. But as life has a way of doing, peace wasn't meant to last. It began subtly, first with whispers among extended family, and then with a sudden, unexpected visit from my parents. It had been nearly 6 years since I'd last seen them. I thought I'd steeled myself for the inevitable, but their sudden reappearance shook me more than I'd like to admit. One afternoon, there was a knock on my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I hesitated before opening it. When I saw them, Karen and Robert, the people who had left me at Margaret's doorstep like an unwanted package, I froze. Their once pristine appearances had dulled. Karen looked tired, lines etched deep into her face, while Robert avoided eye contact, his posture unusually hunched. "Emily," Karen started, her voice softer than I remembered. "Can we come in?" I should have slammed the door in their faces. I wanted to, but something stopped me. Maybe curiosity, maybe an old habit of wanting their approval. Against my better judgment, I stepped aside and let them in. They sat awkwardly on my couch, their presence heavy in the room. I crossed my arms, leaning against the wall, keeping my distance. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice colder than I'd intended. Karen wrung her hands, glancing at Robert for support, but he just stared at the floor. Finally, she said, "We're here because we need your help." I almost laughed. After all these years, after everything they'd done, or rather, hadn't done, they were coming to me for help? The irony was suffocating. "Help with what?" I asked, narrowing my eyes. Karen hesitated, but then the words came tumbling out. "It's your brother, Ethan. He's struggling. He's gotten himself into some trouble, and we don't know what to do." Trouble? That word lingered in the air like smoke. I didn't need to ask what kind of trouble. Their faces said it all. Drugs, gambling, or some other destructive behavior. It didn't matter. They were here because the golden child, their perfect son, had stumbled, and now they were desperate. "What does this have to do with me?" I asked, my tone sharper now. Karen's eyes welled up with tears. "We need financial help, Emily. We've exhausted everything we have, and Ethan, he needs rehab. It's expensive, and we just can't afford it. Your grandmother left you everything, and—" I held up a hand to stop her. The audacity of it all was almost too much to bear. "Let me get this straight," I interrupted. "You abandoned me. You left me with Grandma because I was too much for you to handle, and now that your precious son has messed up, you think I owe you my inheritance?" Robert finally spoke, his voice low and gruff. "He's your brother, Emily. Family helps family." I laughed bitterly. "Family? You mean like how you helped me? How you locked me in my room for a week and called me a freak? How did you leave me at Grandma's doorstep without a second thought? Is that the kind of family you're talking about?" They flinched at my words, but I didn't care. I was sugarcoating things for their benefit. Karen began to cry in earnest now, but her tears didn't move me. I'd spent too many nights crying into my pillow, wondering why I wasn't enough for them, why they couldn't love me the way they loved Ethan. Her tears were nothing compared to mine. "Please, Emily," she said between sobs. "Ethan needs help. You can make a difference. Isn't that what Grandma would have wanted?" That struck a nerve. Using Margaret's name against me was a low blow, and it made my anger bubble over. "Don't you dare bring Grandma into this," I snapped. "She was the only one who ever cared about me. She gave me a life when you threw me away. She wouldn't want me to help you, not after what you did to both of us." Karen's sobs turned into quiet sniffles, and Robert looked like he wanted to say something, but thought better of it. The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable. Finally, I took a deep breath and spoke, my voice steady but firm. "I'll make you an offer. I'll help Ethan, pay for the rehab, the work, but only on one condition." Their heads shot up, a glimmer of hope in their eyes. "What condition?" Robert asked cautiously. "You publicly acknowledge everything you did to me, every insult, every abandonment, every way you failed as parents, and not just to me, to the whole family. I want everyone to know the truth." Karen's face crumpled and Robert's jaw tightened. They looked at each other, then back at me, horror etched into their expressions. "You can't be serious," Karen whispered. "Oh, I'm dead serious," I replied. "If you want my help, you're going to have to own up to what you did. Otherwise, you can leave and figure this out on your own." They sat there, stunned, as if they couldn't believe what they were hearing. I crossed my arms again, waiting. For the first time in years, I felt like I had the upper hand, and it was empowering. Eventually, Karen stood, her movement slow and deliberate. "You're cruel," she said, her voice trembling. I thought you'd changed." I laughed again, but this time it was cold and hollow. "Changed? Oh, I have. I've learned that I don't owe you anything, least of all my kindness." Robert muttered something under his breath, but I didn't catch it. They left without another word, the door slamming shut behind them. As I stood in the silence of my apartment, my emotions churned. Part of me felt triumphant. I'd finally stood up to them, made it clear that they couldn't manipulate me anymore. But another part of me, the part that still craved their love and approval, felt hollow. They had come to me because they needed me, not because they wanted me. And even now, when the tables had turned, they couldn't bring themselves to do the one thing I'd asked, admit they were wrong. I sat down on the couch, my head in my hands. Margaret's voice echoed in my mind, reminding me of my worth, of the strength I'd built over the years. I wasn't the same broken kid they'd abandoned. I was stronger now, and I wouldn't let them pull me back into their mess. For the first time, I felt truly free. After Karen and Robert walked out of my apartment, the weight of the confrontation lingered. I sat there for what felt like hours, replaying the conversation in my head. Every word they said, every plea they made, and every response I gave echoed in the silence. It was exhausting, but it was also liberating. For the first time in my life, I had taken control of the narrative. The next few weeks passed quietly. I stayed busy with work, friends, and settling back into a routine. My parents didn't reach out again, and I was grateful for the peace. I blocked their numbers after that encounter, not because I was angry, but because I needed space. I had spent so many years chasing their approval, letting their words and actions define my worth. I wasn't going to let them have that power anymore, but their absence didn't mean the memories faded. On some nights, I still lay awake, thinking about how things could have been different. What if they had been better parents? What if they had tried harder to understand me? These thoughts didn't hurt as much as they once did, but they still carried a tinge of sadness. A few months later, I got a call from an unfamiliar number. Against my better judgment, I answered, and to my surprise, it was Ethan. His voice was shaky, his words hesitant. "Emily," he started. I just wanted to apologize. I didn't say anything, letting him continue. I know Mom and Dad weren't there for you. I know they treated you horribly, and I didn't do anything to stop it. I thought if I kept my head down, it wouldn't be as bad for me. That was selfish. I'm sorry. His words caught me off guard. Ethan had always been the golden child, the one who basked in our parents' attention and approval. Hearing him admit his guilt was unexpected, but not unwelcome. Thank you, I said finally. It means a lot to hear you say that. He hesitated, then added, I'm in rehab now. It's not the fancy place they wanted, but it's helping. I just thought you should know. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to be angry, that he had followed our parents' lead for so long, that he had ignored my pain while living comfortably in their love. But another part of me felt something different, compassion. He had his struggles, just like I had mine, and now he was trying to make things right. I'm glad you're getting help, Ethan, I said. I really am, and for what it's worth, I forgive you. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before he finally said, Thank you, Emily. That means more than you know. After that call, something shifted in me. Forgiving Ethan didn't erase the pain of the past, but it lightened the burden I had been carrying for so long. It reminded me that people could change, that growth was possible. It didn't excuse what my parents had done, but it gave me hope that maybe, just maybe, they could change too, if they wanted to. A few months later, I received a letter in the mail. The handwriting was familiar, and my stomach twisted as I opened it. It was from Karen. She didn't apologize outright, but the tone was softer than I'd ever heard from her. Emily, it began, I've been thinking a lot about what you said. You're right, we failed you. I don't know if you'll ever forgive us, and I don't expect you to. But I wanted to say that I'm sorry for the pain we caused. You deserved better. I hope you're doing well. Love, Mom. I stared at the letter for a long time, my emotions swirling. It wasn't the grand public apology I had demanded, but it was something. It was a step. I didn't write back right away. I wasn't sure if I wanted to, but the letter stayed on my nightstand, a reminder that even the most flawed people could try to make amends. As the years went by, my life continued to grow and flourish. I built a career I was proud of, made friends who felt like family, and even found love. Through it all, I carried Margaret's lessons with me, her belief in the power of kindness, resilience, and forgiveness. I didn't forget what my parents had done, and I didn't let them back into my life completely, but I found a way to make peace with the past. I forgave them, not for their sake, but for mine. Holding on to anger only gave them more power, and I refused to let them take any more from me. On what would have been Margaret's 80th birthday, I visited her grave. I brought flowers, her favorite yellow daisies, and sat by her headstone, talking to her as if she were right there with me. You were right, Grandma, I said, smiling through tears. I made it, and it's all because of you. The wind rustled through the trees, and for a moment, I felt her presence. I knew she would always be with me, guiding me, reminding me of my worth. Looking back, my journey wasn't easy. It was filled with pain, anger, and heartbreak, but it was also filled with love, growth, and resilience. Margaret gave me the foundation I needed to rebuild my life, and for that, I would always be grateful. I may not have had the family I wanted, but I had the family I needed, and that was enough.